The year is 39 AD and Rome is not sleeping. If you were to stand on the banks of the Tiber River at this hour, looking up toward the heights of the Palatine Hill, you would see a sight that resembles a sleeping beast, its eyes glowing with the amber light of 1,000 oil lamps. This is the Imperial Palace. From a distance, it looks like a beacon of civilization, a crowning jewel of marble and gold that rules over the known world. But distance is a deceptive thing. If you were to walk up those stone paths, past the Praetorian guards who stand like statues with eyes of flint, and if you were to press your ear against the cold walls of the Imperial Dining Hall, you would hear the sounds of a celebration. You would hear the delicate melody of lyres, the clinking of silver goblets, the heavy scent of roasted meats and expensive perfumes drifting on the night air. You would hear laughter, loud, raucous, unending laughter. But listen closely. There is a discordance in the sound. The laughter is too sharp, too immediate, coming a fraction of a second too quickly after a joke is made. It is the sound of men and women who are terrified that silence might be interpreted as treason. Tonight, Rome breathes like a giant. It is a city that has conquered the Mediterranean, defeated Carthage, and subdued the Gauls. Yet tonight, its most powerful citizens are trembling. Inside the Great Hall, the scene is designed to overwhelm the senses. The walls are clad in polished stone that reflects the dancing flames of the lamps, creating a shifting, dreamlike atmosphere. Slaves move silently across the mosaic floors, pouring Falernian wine into cups that never stay empty. The guests are the elite of the empire, senators wrapped in their togas with the broad purple stripe of their rank, men who command legions and dictate laws. Beside them sit their wives, women of noble lineage, draped in silks from the east, their hair piled high in intricate curls held by pins of gold and ivory. They sit like living statues, their faces masks of carefully practiced serenity. Everything here is designed to transmit greatness. The abundance of food, the richness of the decor, the orchestrated beauty of the evening, it is all a testament to the glory of the Caesars. But look at their eyes. Do not look at their smiles. Look at their hands, gripping the stems of their wine cups until their knuckles turn white. Look at the way they glance toward the great double doors at the end of the hall, avoiding them and yet unable to look away. There is an invisible tremor in the air, a vibration that has nothing to do with the wind outside. Rome is celebrating, yes, but it does so with a shrunken heart. The banquet advances. The conversations are held in low voices, a hum of trivialities. No one speaks of politics. No one speaks of the grain supply or the legions on the Rhine. To speak of serious matters is to risk attention, and tonight, attention is a death sentence. They speak of the weather, of the races at the circus, of the quality of the wine. They fill the air with words to build a wall between themselves and the fear that sits at the center of the room. And then, it happens. The music does not stop, but the musicians seem to play quieter, instinctively. The conversations die out, not all at once, but in a wave, like a flame being snuffed out by a sudden draft. The silence that falls over the room is heavy, physical. It falls like a slab of lead. From the dark corridor beyond the main entrance, the rhythmic sound of footsteps echoes against the stone. Clack, clack, clack. They are military sandals, caligae, reinforced with iron hobnails. They are not rushing. They are deliberate. They are the footsteps of a man who knows that the world will wait for him. The doors open. He enters. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. The world knows him as Caligula, a nickname born in the military camps of his childhood, meaning little boot. But there is nothing small about the shadow he casts over this room. He is young, barely into his 20s, with a face that carries the handsome, sharp features of the Julio-Claudian line, yet distorted by something that the sculptors of the time struggled to capture. It is an expression that no one in the room dares to interpret. Is it boredom? Is it malice? Is it a divine detachment from the concerns of mortals? He pauses at the threshold. He does not greet the Senate. He does not nod to the consuls. To acknowledge them would be to imply that they exist on a plane worthy of his recognition. Instead, he simply stands there, letting the silence stretch until it becomes physically painful. His eyes, pale and unblinking, begin to scan the crowd. He looks at them not as a ruler looks at his subjects, but as a child looks at a collection of toys, or perhaps as a wolf looks at a flock of sheep, deciding which one will serve his hunger. He moves into the room. The air seems to leave the lungs of 300 people simultaneously. He walks past the tables, ignoring the bowed heads, the averted gazes. He is looking for something specific. He stops. He is standing in front of a prominent senator, a man whose family name has been etched into the foundation of Rome for generations. Beside the senator sits his wife, a woman of renowned beauty and virtue, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. Caligula looks at the senator, then at the wife. The tension is so thick it could be cut with a knife. The music has stopped completely now. Even the slaves have frozen in the shadows. Caligula lifts a hand, his fingers adorned with rings that could buy a province. He points a single finger at the woman. "Tonight," he says, his voice soft, almost conversational, "she is mine." It is not a question. It is not an invitation. It is not even a demand. It is a decree, as absolute as the movement of the stars. The room freezes. Time seems to suspend. In any other era, under the Republic, such an insult would have drawn daggers. Men would have died to protect the honor of their house. But this is not the Republic. This is the new Rome. The senator does not move. He does not stand. He does not protest. He sits there, turning to stone, his face drained of blood. The woman does not scream. She knows, as everyone in that room knows, that the rules of the universe have changed. In Rome, when the man who holds absolute power speaks, the law bends, and morality dissolves into mist. To refuse would not simply be a lack of respect. It would be a direct challenge to the axis of the empire itself. It would be an act of suicide that would not just kill the husband and wife, but would erase their children, their cousins, their family name from the registers of history. Their statues would be smashed, their property seized, their memory cursed. So, nobody breathes. And thus, while the music tentatively begins again below, disguising the tragedy with sweet melodies, the first crack of the night opens wide. The banquet continues, but the soul of the room has been gutted. Decades later, long after the oil lamps of this night had burned out, fragments of letters found in the dusty archives of the Vatican would reveal the true extent of this terror. These were not official histories, but desperate, private scribbles. They revealed that many senators, men of immense public power, were secretly writing to their relatives in the provinces, begging them, pleading with them never to bring their wives or daughters to the capital. These men, accustomed to dictating laws to nations and commanding armies that shook the earth, were discovering a terrifying truth. In the face of a single individual who has discarded all limits, all their authority was smoke, Caligula was not simply capricious, as the popular versions of history often tell it. He was not merely a madman acting at random. According to the ancient documents and a careful reading of the social climate, he understood perfectly what he was doing. He understood the dark alchemy of power. He knew that true dominance is not just about controlling armies. It is about blurring the lines between what is permitted and what is unthinkable. For 4 years, the Roman Empire became a laboratory, and Caligula was the scientist, testing exactly how much pressure he could apply to the human spirit before the society broke. To understand the magnitude of the terror that paralyzed the room that night, we must pause the scene. We must look past the trembling hands of the senators and the averted eyes of their wives. We must look directly at the man standing in the center of the mosaic floor. The history books often reduce Caligula to a caricature, a raving madman, a cartoon villain who made his horse a consul. But the truth, as hinted at in the ancient texts and confirmed by the silent testimony of the archaeology, is far more disturbing. Madness implies a lack of control, a chaotic mind firing at random. But what entered the dining hall that night was not chaos. It was a cold, calculating intelligence that had turned the entire Roman Empire into a psychological laboratory. The man standing in the flickering lamplight is 27 years old. Physically, he is imposing, though perhaps not in the way the statues would later idealize. Historical descriptions suggest a man prematurely balding, with a pale complexion and eyes that were described as hollow and fixed. Suetonius, the ancient biographer, tells us that Caligula would spend hours in front of a mirror, practicing terrifying expressions, learning how to contort his face to maximize the unease of those around him. This was not the behavior of a lunatic. It was the rehearsal of an actor perfecting his role. And his role was the absolute master of reality. When he walks into the room, the silence that follows is not just born of fear. It is born of a profound cognitive dissonance. The men sitting at these tables, the senators, remember his father. They remember Germanicus. The name Germanicus was holy in Rome, a name that conjured images of military glory, stoic virtue, and the perfect Roman ideal. When the people looked at Caligula, They searched desperately for the father in the son. They wanted to see the hero. Instead, they saw distortion, a dark reflection where the features were familiar, but the spirit was entirely alien. It is this contrast that makes the atmosphere so suffocating. He carries the blood of the gods and the heroes, but he uses it to dismantle the very civilization they built. As Caligula stands there, letting the silence stretch, he is not merely being dramatic, he is measuring. The empire for him has become a testing ground for a single, terrifying question. How much pressure can I exert before the society breaks? He is testing the elasticity of Roman morality. He wants to know if the men who conquered the world have any spine left, or if their ambition has made them hollow. The most unsettling aspect of this laboratory is that these rituals are not performed in secret. This is a crucial detail that often escapes modern understanding. We tend to think of tyranny happening in dungeons, behind locked doors. But in Caligula's Rome, the horror is public. The entire city knows that something dark is germinating in the palace. The rumors float through the Subura and the Forum. Everyone knows that the rules of nature are being bent on the Palatine Hill. But no one dares to name it. Why? Because when a leader demonstrates that no norm divine or human can contain him, the city ceases to be a community. It becomes a stage where fear dictates every gesture. To name the horror is to make it real. And to make it real is to admit that there is no one left to protect you. So, Rome chooses blindness. But tonight, in this hall, blindness is not an option. Caligula begins to move again. His movements are slow, almost languid. He walks between the tables, his toga rustling softly, a sound that seems deafening in the quiet. He stops behind the chair of a consul, leaning in close enough to smell the man's sweat, then moves on. He is playing with them. He is the cat, and the Senate is a collection of mice who have forgotten they have teeth. He reaches the center of the room. His eyes, those pale, unblinking eyes, scan the multitude. He looks at the faces of the women, the matrons of Rome. These are women whose virtue is the bedrock of their family's honor. In Roman society, the pudicitia, modesty of a wife, is not just a personal trait. It is a political asset. To touch a senator's wife is to attack the senator's lineage, his ancestors, and his future. Caligula knows this. In fact, that is exactly why he is doing it. He is not driven by lust, at least. Not lust in the simple, carnal sense. If he wanted sex, he had access to thousands of slaves, courtesans, and willing lovers. No, what he craves tonight is not pleasure. It is violation. He wants to prove that the boundaries that define their lives, the boundaries of marriage, of rank, of sacred vows, are nothing more than lines in the sand. And he is the tide. He stops. His gaze locks onto a specific woman. She is the wife of a man who commands respect. A man who perhaps thought himself safe due to his high standing. The woman feels the weight of his stare. She likely wishes she could shrink, disappear, dissolve into the marble floor, but she cannot move. To look away would be an insult. To look back would be a challenge. So she stares at her hands, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Caligula smiles. It is a smile that does not reach his eyes. He raises his hand. The gesture is casual, almost lazy. He points at her. The air in the room seems to vanish. The music, which had tried to restart, dies instantly. Tonight, he says, and his voice carries to the corners of the hall, clear and terrifyingly calm, she is mine. The words hang in the air. They are not an invitation. They are a decree. It is a statement of ownership that strips the woman of her humanity and the husband of his dignity in a single breath. No one breathes. The senator, her husband, does not move. The woman does not weep. They are frozen in the amber of absolute terror. Everyone in the room knows that in this moment, the Republic is truly dead. There is no law to appeal to. There is no magistrate to call. There is only the whim of the man standing before them. Neglecting to obey would not simply be a lack of respect. It would be a direct challenge to the axis of the empire. It would be an act that could erase the name of an entire family from the registers. And so, while the music continues below, disguising the tragedy with melodies, the first great crack of the night opens. The laboratory experiment has begun, and the test subject, the Roman soul, is about to be stretched until it tears. The sentence hangs in the stagnant air of the banquet hall, like the blade of a guillotine that has been released but has not yet struck the neck. Tonight, she is mine. For a terrible, stretched second, the mind of the senator, the husband, revolts against reality. His training, his heritage, and the centuries of Roman tradition screaming in his blood tell him that this is impossible. He is a paterfamilias. Paterfamilias. In the legal and spiritual structure of Rome, the paterfamilias is not merely a father, he is the absolute sovereign of his household. He holds the patria potestas, the power of life and death over his children, his slaves, and, to a significant degree, the moral custody of his wife. Within the walls of his home, he is a king. To take his wife is not just theft, it is the dismantling of his legal existence. But here, on the Palatine Hill, the ancient laws of Rome have evaporated. 2 Praetorian guards step forward from the shadows. They do not draw their weapons. They do not need to. Their mere presence, armored and impassive, is a physical manifestation of the emperor's will. They approach the table. The woman, whose name the history books often forget to record, leaving her as a ghost in the narrative of men, stands up. She does not look at her husband. Perhaps she cannot bear to see his shame, or perhaps she is trying to save his life by not engaging him. If she screams, if she clings to his toga, she forces him to make a choice: die fighting in a futile gesture, or publicly reject her to save himself. By rising silently, she grants him the only mercy available in this room, the mercy of inaction. She walks toward Caligula. The emperor does not offer her his arm. He turns his back on the room, assuming she will follow. And she does. They walk toward the side doors, the heavy bronze closing behind them with a finality that echoes in the marrow of every guest present. The banquet hall is left in a state of suspended animation. The husband remains seated. His hand is still wrapped around his wine cup, his knuckles white, the silver biting into his palm. He stares at the empty space where his wife had been moments ago. In any other time under the Republic, or even under the stern rule of Augustus, this man would have been expected to act. Honor demanded blood. But Caligula has introduced a new, paralyzing variable to the equation: total annihilation. Everyone in the room knows the stakes. If the senator had stood up, if he had thrown his goblet at the emperor or drawn a dining knife, he would not have just died. That would be simple. Caligula would have unleashed the damnatio memoriae upon his entire lineage. His children would be executed or sold. His property would be seized. His ancestor statues would be smashed, their names chiseled off public monuments. To resist is to doom one's past and one's future simultaneously. So, the senator sits. He swallows his rage until it tastes like bile, and he remains motionless. This moment represents the true death of the Roman Republic. The Republic was built on the idea of competing dignities, that no one man was so great that he could not be challenged by another man of virtue. But in this dining hall, the concept of dignity has been stripped away. Caligula has proven that the senator is not a partner in governance. He is livestock. He is property. Then, the most horrific part of the evening begins. The doors are closed. The emperor is gone, and the silence stretches too long. A servant, terrified and trembling, signals to the musicians. The lyres begin to strum again. A nervous, jagged melody floats through the air. Conversations resume, but they are grotesque pantomimes of social interaction. Guests lean in to whisper, but they are not sharing gossip. They are sharing shock. Did you see his face? Don't look at him. Don't draw attention. Drink your wine. The senator sits there, surrounded by his peers, yet completely alone. He cannot leave. To leave would be an insult to the host. He must stay. He must eat the emperor's food. He must drink the emperor's wine. He must endure the pitying glances of men who are secretly relieved that it wasn't their wife, and the terrified glances of women who wonder if they are next. This psychological torture is precise. Caligula has not just taken a woman. He has taken the social contract of Rome and torn it in half. He has demonstrated that the law is no longer a set of written rules carved on bronze tablets in the Forum. The law is now biological. The law is his mood. The law is his desire. If he wakes up tomorrow and decides that the sun is the moon, the Senate must vote to agree. If he decides that a wife is a whore, the husband must nod. As the night drags on, the atmosphere shifts from shock to a strange, dissociative numbness. The guests continue to perform the rituals of the banquet because the ritual is the only thing keeping the terror at bay. If they stop acting like everything is normal, the reality of their situation will crush them. They are hostages, in silk robes. The ancient sources, particularly the writings of Suetonius and later historians like Cassius Dio, suggest that Caligula understood exactly what he was breaking. He was the great-grandson of Augustus. Augustus had spent his entire reign trying to restore the moral fiber of Rome, passing the Lex Julia, laws that punished adultery and protected the sanctity of marriage. Caligula is not just violating a woman, he is urinating on the legacy of his own dynasty. He is showing them that the moral posturing of the empire is a lie. There is no morality, only power. When the doors eventually open again later that night, or perhaps the next day, accounts vary on the duration of these abductions, the dynamic has permanently shifted. When the wife returns, if she returns, the silence between her and her husband is heavier than any scream. They are both survivors of a shipwreck, but something vital has drowned. The paterfamilias is dead, only the biological shell remains. This specific incident, repeated in various forms throughout his reign, was the hammer blow that cracked the foundation of Roman society. It wasn't the extravagance of the banquets or the cost of the games that terrified the elite. It was this theft of dignity. You can tax a man's wealth, and he will grumble. You can limit his political influence, and he will scheme. But if you take his dignity, if you force him to sit and watch while you dismantle his honor, you break his soul. Or so Caligula thought. What the emperor failed to calculate in his arrogance was that dignity is not just a social construct, it is a survival mechanism. By stripping these men of their honor, he was removing the very thing that kept them loyal to the system. A man with nothing to lose is dangerous, but a man with everything to lose, who has already lost the most important part of himself, is unpredictable. As the guests eventually filed out of the palace that night, stepping into the cool air of the Roman dawn, the city below them looked the same. The bakers were lighting their ovens. The carts were rumbling over the cobblestones. But for the men and women descending the Palatine Hill, the world had fundamentally altered. They walked with their heads down, not looking at each other, shadows adhering to their skin. They realized then that the palace was not a house of government, it was a predator's den. And they were all, every single one of them, merely meat waiting for their turn. The terror of the Palatine did not stay confined to the marble halls of the palace. Like a slow-moving fog, it drifted down the hill and seeped into the private villas of the aristocracy. The true genius of Caligula's tyranny was not what he did when he was in the room, but what he made people do when he was absent. He turned silence into a survival strategy, and in doing so, he weaponized the love fathers felt for their daughters and husbands, for their wives. For centuries, the extent of this psychological siege was largely a matter of speculation, pieced together from the sensationalist accounts of biographers like Suetonius. But history has a way of hiding its truest voices in the quietest places. In 1962, a significant discovery in the Vatican archives threw a piercing light onto the domestic nightmare of this era. Researchers uncovered fragments of correspondence, private letters written by Roman senators to their families stationed in distant provinces like Gaul, Syria, or North Africa. These were not official dispatches. They were frantic, coded warnings scribbled on papyrus, intended to be read once and then burned. The letters did not describe the horrors of the banquets explicitly. To write down the crimes of the emperor was treason, and a scroll could be intercepted by a spy or a bribed courier. Instead, these men, trained in rhetoric and law, resorted to a heartbreaking language of metaphor and omission. They used elliptical phrases and obscure references to mythology to convey a single, urgent message. "The wind in the city has turned pestilent," one fragment reads. "The gardens here no longer bloom for the virtuous." Another, more direct in its desperation, simply implored, "Do not bring the women to Rome. The honor we cherish is no longer under the protection of the gods, but subject to the appetites of a single man." These fragments reveal a society in a state of self-imposed quarantine. The senators were effectively telling their sons and brothers, "Stay away. Rome is no longer home. Rome is a trap." Historians and sociologists have a term for this phenomenon: the architecture of fear. It is a process where the mechanism of censorship shifts. It no longer comes from the state bureaucracy or the lictors patrolling the streets. It moves inside the mind of the citizen. The terror becomes internalized. Every father becomes his own censor, every husband a jailer of his own family, not out of cruelty, but out of a desperate need to protect them from a predator who recognizes no boundaries. This phenomenon was not unique to Caligula's Rome. We see the same pattern echoing through the corridors of history, in the paranoid courts of the Hellenistic kingdoms, in the purges of modern dictatorships. The rules change, the technology of oppression evolves, but the human reaction remains devastatingly consistent. When the punishment for a crime no longer depends on written law but on the fluctuating humor of the ruler, the the citizenry transforms into a silent multitude. In the Roman Republic, a man's voice was his currency. Debate was the engine of the state. But under Caligula, the voice became a liability. To speak was to risk slipping. To argue was to court death. And so, the distinct, clamorous voices of Rome merged into a single, suffocating hum of compliance. The 1,962 letters reveal that the Roman aristocracy understood exactly what was happening to them. They were not naive. They knew that the golden age of Augustus had rotted into something vile. One particular letter, analyzed by scholars for its breathless syntax, warns that the shepherd has become the wolf, and the flock has nowhere to run. The most chilling aspect of this silence is that Caligula relied on it. He didn't need to station a guard in every home. He didn't need to listen at every keyhole. He knew that the fear he had instilled during those banquet nights would do the work for him. He knew that a senator would lock his own daughter in her room, not to punish her, but to keep her from being seen by the wrong eyes. He knew that families would stop hosting dinners, stop attending the theater, stop gathering in public squares. He had successfully isolated them by fragmenting the social bonds of the city, by making every family an island of paranoia. Caligula ensured that no organized resistance could form. You cannot conspire against a tyrant if you are too afraid to speak truthfully to your own neighbor. You cannot organize a coup if you are consumed by the terror of losing your wife. Thus, the true kingdom of Caligula was not built of marble and gold, as the ruins might suggest. It was built of this thick, impenetrable silence. It was a kingdom where the most powerful men in the world walked on eggshells, terrified of their own shadows. And as the silence deepened, the emperor realized that he had achieved total impunity. The society had surrendered its voice. The checks and balances were gone. The laboratory of power had yielded its result. The subject was broken. Now, Caligula could move to the next phase of his experiment. If he could silence the present, perhaps he could also rewrite the past and reshape the very nature of reality itself. Rome was quiet, and in that quiet, the monster on the Palatine began to dream of even darker games. To dismiss Caligula merely as a lunatic is to underestimate the terrifying clarity of his vision. Madness is chaotic. It strikes without rhythm or reason. But the terror that descended upon Rome in these years had a rhythm. It had a structure. It was, in many ways, a grand psychological experiment conducted on a scale never before seen in human history. The empire had become a laboratory, and the emperor was the lead scientist, probing a single dangerous hypothesis. If I possess the power to do anything, does morality still exist? Or is it just a story weak men tell themselves? To understand how a young man of 25 could conceive of such a monstrous test, we must look backward, to the dark cliffs of the island of Capri. This is where the experiment truly began. Before he was the master of the world, Caligula was a hostage. He spent his formative years living with his great-uncle, the Emperor Tiberius, a man consumed by paranoia and bitterness. Capri was not a home, it was a prison disguised as a paradise. There, the young Caligula watched as the most powerful man on earth indulged in depravities that would make a satyr blush, while simultaneously ordering the execution of Rome's finest citizens with the stroke of a pen. He watched his own mother and brothers be exiled and starved to death by the very man he had to dine with every evening. He learned to smile while his heart turned to ice. He learned to flatter the murderer of his family. Tiberius himself, observing the boy's cold, watchful eyes, once remarked that he was nursing a viper for the Roman people. On those wind-swept cliffs, Caligula learned the most dangerous lesson a ruler can learn. Absolute power does not just mean you can kill people. It means you can rewrite reality. He saw that if you are powerful enough, you can force noblemen to act like slaves. You can turn cruelty into law. And crucially, no bolt of lightning will strike you down. The gods stay silent. When he ascended to the throne, Caligula brought this lesson to Rome. But unlike Tiberius, who hid his perversions on a remote island, Caligula decided to perform them on the center stage of the world. He treated the Senate, the equestrian order, and the populace as variables in his equation. He needed to know where the breaking point was. If he appointed a horse as a priest, would they revolt? No. They smiled and praised the horse. If he marched his army to the English Channel and ordered them to collect seashells as spoils of war, would the generals mutiny? No. They filled their helmets with shells. The most unsettling aspect of this laboratory was the transparency of it all. Rome knew. The rumors didn't need to travel far because the emperor performed his atrocities in the open. The rituals of humiliation, the arbitrary executions, the sudden seizures of property, these were not secrets. They were public announcements. By forcing the entire city to witness his behavior without intervening, he made them accomplices. This is the darkest genius of his reign. When a society watches a crime and does nothing, it loses its moral high ground. The silence of the Senate was not just fear. It was a surrender of their right to judge. Every time they applauded a speech they knew was insane, or laughed at a joke that was cruel, they chipped away at their own souls. Rome became a theater of the absurd. The citizens began to question their own perceptions. Was this normal? Had the world always been this way? The emperor's power was so total that it warped the collective psyche of the city. He proved that social norms, tradition, piety, honor were fragile constructs that could be blown away by the breath of one man. For 4 years, he pushed. He pressed his thumb against the scale of Roman civilization, adding more and more weight, waiting for the snap. But the snap didn't come in the form of a rebellion, at least not yet. Instead, the society simply bent. It contorted itself into grotesque shapes to accommodate his whims. The empire was no longer a political entity. It was a projection of Caligula's trauma, and having proven that he could break the will of the men of Rome, he turned his eyes toward the next phase of his experiment. He would dismantle the sanctity of the private sphere. He would invade the one place the Romans believed was sacred and untouchable, the hidden rooms behind the heavy curtains of the palace, where the last vestiges of dignity went to die. As the silence solidified over Rome, the Palatine Palace underwent a transformation. If the banquet hall was the stage for public domination, the corridors that lay beyond were the machinery of a much more intimate destruction. Caligula, having tested the limits of the Senate in the open, now devised a mechanism to dismantle the private souls of his subjects. He understood that to truly own a man, you must control not just his political allegiance, but his biological lineage. You must pollute the sanctuary of his family. The invitations sent to the senatorial families often seemed benign, a celebration of the harvest, a night to honor the muses, or simply a royal gathering. But those who received the wax tablets felt the blood drain from their faces. They knew that the innocent words were a facade. The Palatine had become a labyrinth where the ordinary rules of civilization were suspended, and a new, darker geometry applied. Upon arrival, the ritual of separation began. It was efficient, almost bureaucratic in its precision. The guests were ushered into the main atrium, but they did not remain together. With a gesture that brooked no argument, the Praetorian Guardsmen, chosen for their size and their ability to remain stone-faced in the presence of atrocities, divided the couples. The men were led to the left, into long, dimly lit antechambers. The women were led to the right, toward the hidden rooms, spaces shielded by heavy velvet curtains that seemed to absorb the light. The men's chamber was a study in psychological warfare. The lighting was deliberately low, the oil lamps sputtering in the drafts, casting long, wavering shadows against the frescoes. There was no music here, no food, only rows of benches and the silent, imposing presence of the guards. The soldiers did not speak. They didn't need to. Their hands resting on the pommels of their gladius swords were a constant reminder that there was no exit. In this purgatory, the most powerful men in the empire sat and waited. They were consuls who had led legions into the forests of Germania. They were lawyers whose oratory could sway the mob in the forum. But here, in the semi-darkness, they were reduced to trembling children. They sat in silence, staring at the floor, or at the wall, or at their own hands. But their ears were straining. They were listening with a painful intensity for any sound coming from the other side of the palace. Sometimes they heard laughter Caligula's high, manic laugh echoing through the stone corridors. Sometimes they heard music, a discordant melody played on a flute. And sometimes, worst of all, they heard nothing. The silence was a canvas upon which their minds painted the most horrific images imaginable. Behind the heavy curtains in the women's wing, a different kind of ritual was taking place. The ancient sources, even in their most scandalous passages, often resort to euphemisms here. They speak of rites of consecration or nocturnal tributes. But the reality was a systematic violation designed to break the spirit. These were not acts of passion, they were acts of power. Caligula viewed these women not as lovers, but as trophies taken from a conquered enemy. By forcing the wives of the Senate to submit to him and often to his guards or favorite freedmen, He was sending a message that transcended simple lust. He was telling the aristocracy, "Your bloodlines are mine, your heirs are mine. The sanctity of your marriage exists only because I allow it." The spaces themselves were designed to disorient. Perfumes burned so thickly that the air became cloying and sweet, masking the smell of sweat and fear. The decor was a chaotic mix of luxury and obscenity, forcing the women to navigate a world where the visual language of Rome had been twisted into a nightmare. Back in the waiting room, the husbands endured a torture that was perhaps even more refined. To know that your wife is being violated is one thing. To be forced to sit 100 feet away, physically capable of intervening but paralyzed by the certainty of death, is another. It creates a fracture in the psyche that never heals. It breeds a self-loathing so deep it eats away the soul. Lucio Vitellius, a man of immense political stature, would later be described in histories as the ultimate sycophant, a man who worshipped Caligula as a god. But looking at this scene, we understand why. His sycophancy was not born of admiration. It was born of a total, catastrophic breakdown of the will. He had sat in these rooms. He had waited. He had learned that the only way to survive the monster was to feed it whatever it asked for. When the night finally ended, and the women were led back to the atrium to rejoin their husbands, the reunion was the final twist of the knife. There were no tears, no hysterical embraces. To show distress would be to criticize the emperor's hospitality. So, the couples walked out into the cool morning air of the Palatine Gardens side by side, like strangers. The wife adjusted her stole, her face a mask of porcelain emptiness. The husband looked straight ahead, his eyes dead. They walked down the hill to their litters, returning to homes that would never feel safe again. The brilliance of Caligula's mechanism was that it made the victims complicit in their own degradation. By failing to fight, the husbands felt they had participated in the act. By surviving, they felt they had sinned. And guilt, as Caligula knew well, is a far heavier chain than iron. Yet, even this was not enough for the emperor. He did not just want to steal their virtue. He wanted to quantify it. He wanted to turn their shame into a commodity, a ledger entry that would prove once and for all that in his Rome, everything and everyone had a price. The humiliation of the Roman aristocracy did not end when the sun rose and the guests fled the Palatine. If the night was for breaking spirits, the day was for something even more insidious, the bureaucratic cataloging of that destruction. History often remembers the blood, the screams, and the madness. But sometimes, the most chilling evidence of tyranny is found not in a weapon, but in a ledger. Deep within the collections of the British Museum, far removed from the tourists admiring the Elgin marbles or the Rosetta Stone, lies a narrative preserved in the mundane artifacts of the era. The original script mentions a specific discovery, a wax tablet that survived the fires and the rot of centuries. To the untrained eye, it looks like a simple merchant's account book, a list of transactions scratched into beeswax with a stylus. But when the text is deciphered, it reveals a level of cruelty that transcends physical violence. The tablet lists names. They are not the names of slaves or common prostitutes. They are the names of the most noble women in Rome, wives of consuls, daughters of ancient houses, mothers of future leaders. Next to each name is a number, a sum of money. This was Caligula's final twist of the knife. He did not just violate these women, he monetized them. According to the ancient chroniclers, after the rituals in the hidden rooms, the emperor would sometimes order his scribes to record the earnings these women had generated for the imperial treasury. It was a grotesque parody of the vectigal ex capturis, the tax on prostitution that Caligula himself had instituted. By applying this tax to the wives of the Senate, he was making a devastating legal statement. There is no difference between a matron of the Julii family and a streetwalker in the Suburra. Both are merely assets to be used for my profit. This was not a real accounting. The emperor did not need the coin. It was symbolic theater. It was a way to drag the concept of virtus, virtue, through the mud of the marketplace. Imagine the psychological impact on a senator receiving news of this transaction. It was an annihilation of his social standing. In Rome, a man's status was inextricably linked to the purity of his household. By placing a price tag on a noblewoman's body, Caligula was telling her husband that his honor was cheap. It could be calculated, taxed, and filed away in a dusty archive. The message was clear. If I can turn the most respected women of the empire into line items in a ledger, then I can turn the Senate into a collection of clerks. This system did not pursue scandal for the sake of gossip. Scandal fades. This pursued erosion. It was designed to wear down the moral resistance of the elite until they were nothing but shells. When a ruler manages to make the most powerful men in his nation stand still, while their wives are turned into economic units of humiliation, he is building something stronger than fear. He is creating a culture of total complicity. In this environment, the very idea of dissidence began to evaporate. How could you plot against the emperor when you couldn't even look your own wife in the eye? How could you speak of Roman dignity in the Senate House when everyone knew your family name was listed in the emperor's book of horrors? The shame acted as a muzzle. It isolated every man in his own personal hell. Lucio Vitellius, the senator whose agony was captured in the letter found in Florence, embodies this total defeat. "I prayed to lose my hearing," he wrote. He didn't pray for a sword to strike the tyrant down. He didn't pray for the courage to rebel. He prayed for deafness. He prayed for the sensory deprivation necessary to ignore the reality in front of him. This is the ultimate victory of the tyrant, when the victim prefers to mutilate his own senses rather than face the truth. Rome was losing its soul. The delicate fabric of trust, tradition, and honor that had held the Republic together for 500 years was being unraveled, thread by thread. The city was becoming a hollowed-out monument, beautiful on the outside but rotten within. And Caligula, watching from the terraces of the palace, saw that his work on the human level was complete. He had broken the men. He had commodified the women. He had turned the aristocracy into a trembling herd. But for a mind as expansive and fractured as his, dominating humanity was no longer enough. The earth was too small a stage. If he was to be truly alone, truly above the laws that bound these lesser creatures, he needed to ascend. He needed to leave the realm of mortals entirely. And so, having crushed the spirit of Rome, he turned his gaze upward, toward the summit of Olympus. If he could not find an equal among men, he would force the empire to acknowledge that he was something else entirely. He would rewrite the borders between the human and the divine, and he would use his own blood to do it. The destruction of the Roman family was only the prelude. The true ambition of Caligula lay in a territory that was far more dangerous, a place where politics and theology collided with explosive force. Rome was a deeply religious society. It was a civilization built on the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. The Romans believed that their success, their empire, and their very survival depended on maintaining a strict boundary between the mortal and the divine. Men were men, gods were gods. To blur that line was hubris, the kind of arrogance that invited lightning bolts and plagues. But Caligula looked at that line and decided to erase it. He began to mold his image not as a princeps, first citizen, but as a living divinity. And to do this, he needed a partner. He needed a consort who was not just a woman, but a reflection of his own divine essence. The emperor had 3 sisters, Julia Livilla, Agrippina the Younger, and his favorite, Julia Drusilla. The history books record what happened between them, though often in whispers and veiled allusions. Caligula brought his sisters into the heart of his court, granting them honors that no Roman women had ever held. Their faces appeared on coins. Their names were included in the vows of allegiance. But with Drusilla, it went further. The rumors that swirled through the forum spoke of incest. In the Roman mind, incest was nephas, an unspeakable crime against nature. It was a pollution that could stain the entire city. But Caligula did not hide his affection for Drusilla. He paraded it. And here, we must pause to understand the twisted logic of his madness. This was not simply sexual perversion. It was a calculated political strategy, borrowed from the East. Caligula had grown up hearing stories of the Egyptian pharaohs, specifically the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemies, like the gods of Olympus, married their sisters to keep the bloodline pure. Zeus married Hera, Osiris married Isis. By engaging in a relationship with Drusilla, Caligula was sending a message that resonated on a frequency the Senate was terrified to tune into. He was saying, "I am not like you. I am not bound by your petty taboos. I am of a different species. I am a god, and gods mate only with their own kind." The climax of this theological theater occurred in the banquet halls. In a break with all tradition, Drusilla did not sit on a chair like a Roman matron. She reclined on the imperial couch next to Caligula, occupying the place of a wife, in full view of the highest men of the state. Imagine the scene. The senators, men who had spent their lives upholding the strict moral codes of Rome, were forced to watch. They had to raise their cups and toast the couple. They had to smile at the divine pair. It was a test of loyalty so extreme that it shattered the conscience. To object was to call the emperor a criminal. To applaud was to become a heretic to one's own religion. Caligula watched them squirm. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was forcing them to choose between their gods and their emperor. And, one by one, they chose the emperor. This was the performativity of power. By forcing the Senate to accept the unacceptable, Caligula proved that his will was stronger than the laws of nature. He stripped them of their moral compass. If they could accept incest in the palace, they could accept anything. "I am not a man who governs by the mandate of the gods," his actions screamed. "I am a god who governs among men." The danger of this shift was profound. If a ruler claims to be human, he can be judged. He can be criticized for failing to uphold the law. But if he claims to be divine, he is the law. His actions are not choices, they are revelations. How can a mortal judge a god? Even death is no longer a guarantee of his fall. The submission of the Senate ceased to be political. It became religious. It was a surrender of the soul. Drusilla became the centerpiece of this new cult. She was the visible proof of his divinity. As long as she was by his side, Caligula felt untouchable. He had created a closed loop of power, him and his sister, against a world of slaves. But Caligula, for all his delusions, had forgotten one stubborn, immutable fact of existence. Gods may be immortal, but the bodies they inhabit are made of flesh and blood. They can bleed, they can burn with fever, and they can die. In the year 38 AD, the fragile biological reality of the goddess Drusilla would collide with the unforgiving nature of death. And when that happened, the emperor's grief would not be a private sorrow. It would be a cataclysm that would threaten to consume the entire city of Rome. In the year 38 AD, a fever descended upon the Palatine Hill. It was a mundane enemy, a microscopic intruder that cared nothing for titles or divinity. It slipped past the Praetorian guards, drifted through the marble corridors, and settled into the lungs of Julia Drusilla. For weeks, the palace held its breath. The best physicians in the empire, men trained in Alexandria and Athens, gathered around her bed. They burned herbs, applied poultices, and murmured prayers to Apollo. But the fever burned hotter. Caligula, the man who had commanded the Senate to bow and the oceans to yield, found himself standing by a bedside, utterly powerless. He watched the only person he truly loved, the only mirror in which he saw a human reflection of himself, wither away. When Drusilla died, the silence that fell over the room was different from the terrified silence of the banquets. It was the vacuum of a collapsing star. Rome expected a funeral. They expected the traditional conclamatio, the weeping, the tearing of robes, the solemn procession of the ancestors' masks. They prepared for the mourning of a beloved princess. But Caligula did not give them a funeral. He gave them a theology. He refused to accept that Drusilla was dead. To accept her death would be to admit that he, too, was subject to the laws of nature. Instead, he did something that fractured the collective sanity of the city. He declared her a goddess. This was not the symbolic deification usually reserved for dead emperors after a vote by the Senate. This was an immediate, violent rewriting of reality. He proclaimed that he had seen her soul ascend to the heavens to dine with Jupiter. She was now Diva Drusilla, the universal goddess. The reaction of the emperor was a masterclass in psychological tyranny. He issued a decree that placed the Roman people in an impossible double bind. Because Drusilla was now a goddess, mourning her was an act of sacrilege. You do not mourn a deity who has ascended to glory. To weep was treason. However, to celebrate was also forbidden, because the emperor himself was overwhelmed by grief. So, Rome froze. A strange, suffocating paralysis took hold of the city. The historian Suetonius tells us that a man was executed for the crime of selling hot water, because such a mundane act was seen as a sign of disrespect during the holy period. Another citizen was accused of having a happy face and was dragged before the emperor to beg for his life. Caligula fled the city. Unable to bear the sight of the places where she had walked, he ran to the countryside, then to Syracuse. But he sent his madness back to Rome in the form of letters and edicts. He ordered temples to be built in her honor. He commanded that her statue be placed in the Curia, the Senate house, so that every law passed by Rome would be done under her gaze. The priests, terrified and confused, were forced to reorganize the entire religious calendar. They had to invent rituals for a woman they had seen coughing blood just days before. They had to offer sacrifices to a divinity whose body was still cooling in the mausoleum. For Caligula, this was the moment the last tether snapped. Drusilla had been his anchor. She was the only one who could whisper him down from his rages. With her gone, he was alone in a universe of his own making. But rather than retreating into sorrow, he advanced into delusion. He reasoned that if he was alone, it was because he was unique. If death had taken his sister, he would simply conquer death. He would keep her alive through the sheer force of his will. But in doing so, he deepened his own isolation. By making her a goddess, he placed her on a pedestal so high that he could no longer touch her. And by demanding that Rome worship her, he ensured that no one could ever comfort him. The city watched in horror as their emperor turned his personal tragedy into a state religion. They realized that their lives, their commerce, and their very emotions were now hostages to a ghost. The death of Drusilla did not end in the mausoleum. It continued in the architecture of Caligula's mind. As the temples rose and the smoke of sacrifices filled the sky, the emperor began a series of rituals that tested the very definition of sanity. He could not let her go, and so, he replaced the woman with the idol. Ancient sources describe a scene that is both grotesque and deeply tragic. In the dead of night, when the Palatine was shrouded in darkness, Caligula would leave his chambers. He would walk to the new temples dedicated to Diva Drusilla. There, standing before the cold, idealized marble statue of his sister, he would speak to her. He did not pray to her as a suppliant prays to a god. He spoke to her as a husband speaks to a wife, or a brother to a sister. He whispered secrets. He asked for advice on matters of state. And then, in the silence of the temple, he would tilt his head, listening to the stone, nodding as if receiving an answer that only he could hear. A Roman philosopher, whose name was later scraped from the manuscripts to avoid reprisals, wrote a chilling observation of this period. The emperor has stepped off the path of mortals. He confuses marble with flesh, and he demands that we share his vision. This was the crux of the horror. It wasn't enough for Caligula to believe the lie. Everyone else had to believe it too. He began to stage ceremonies that mimicked ancient nuptial rites. He would embrace the statue, treating the stone effigy with a tenderness that he denied to living human beings. The senators, forced to attend these midnight vigils, stood in the shadows, their stomachs churning. They watched the most powerful man in the world caressing a block of stone, seeking warmth in the cold mineral. They realized then that the state was trapped inside the hallucination of a single man. This was a danger far greater than cruelty. A cruel leader can be negotiated with. A delusional one cannot. Caligula had erased the border between the living and the dead. To him, Drusilla was present. She was ruling through him. He began to wear her robes. He would appear in public dressed in the silks of a woman, claiming that he and Drusilla were two halves of the same divine whole. He demanded that the senators treat these displays with absolute seriousness. If a man smirked, he died. If a man looked away, he was banished. The psychological pressure on the court was immense. They were living in a collective gaslight. They had to affirm, every day, that the emperor was sane, that the statue was a goddess, and that the nightmare was a golden age. "I am a god," he told them, "not as a boast, but as a fact, and she is waiting for me." The tragedy of Caligula in this phase is the tragedy of a man screaming into the void and demanding the void scream back. The more he deified Drusilla, the more he felt the crushing weight of his own mortality. He was terrified of death, his own death, and so he tried to build a world where death was just a bureaucratic change of status. But the marble did not speak back. The silence of the statue only amplified the noise in his head. And as the frustration mounted, Caligula's need for control expanded. If he could not command the dead to live, he would command the living to suffer. He would turn his gaze back to the aristocracy. But this time, he wouldn't just take their wives. He would force them to confront the raw, ugly reality of what lay beneath the veneer of Roman civilization. Having blurred the lines between God and man, living and dead, Caligula turned his attention to the final barrier, the line between the highborn and the low. Rome was a society of strict stratification. The senatorial class sat at the top, guardians of virtus, virtue, and dignitas, dignity. At the very bottom were the gladiators and the slaves men of blood and dust, considered infamous by Roman law. They were the entertainment, the disposable flesh used to amuse the masses. These two worlds were never meant to touch. Caligula decided to crash them together. According to fragments of diaries found near Pompeii in 1951, the emperor devised a new form of entertainment for his private banquets. He did not invite the famous gladiators. the celebrities of the arena whom the crowd adored. He ordered the lanistas, gladiator trainers, to send him the wretched ones, the survivors of the morning games, men still covered in the filth of the arena, smelling of fear, dried blood, and the metallic tang of the cage. He brought these men into the pristine, perfumed dining halls of the Palatine. Imagine the sensory assault. On one side of the table sat the matrons of Rome, women who had spent hours being bathed, oiled, and dressed in the finest silks. They were the symbols of Roman purity. On the other side stood men who looked like butchers, their bodies scarred, their nails black with dirt. Caligula would smile that vacant, terrifying smile and give the order, "Let us be entertained." The sources are deliberately vague about what followed, using metaphors of eclipses and shadows. But the implication is clear. He forced an interaction between the apex of society and its dregs. He commanded the noble women to dance with these men, to serve them wine, perhaps even to sit at their feet. It was a visual and olfactory dissonance, designed to induce nausea, the smell of the arena mixing with the scent of lavender, the rough, calloused hand of a killer touching the soft, manicured hand of a consul's wife. For the husbands watching, this was a torture worse than physical pain. It was the pollution of their lineage. Caligula was demonstrating that their nobility was a costume. He was stripping away the myth of Roman superiority. "Look at them," his eyes seemed to say. "Under the silk, under the armor, we are all just meat." Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a man of fierce pride who would later lead a conspiracy against the emperor, left a testimony that survived through the ages. "I saw my wife crumble before my eyes," he wrote. "If I protested, I condemned my children. So I smiled. I applauded. And with every clap of my hands, I died a little more." This was the true purpose of the spectacle. It wasn't just sadism, it was political nihilism. Caligula was showing them that Virtus was a lie. If the emperor could force a noble woman to debase herself with a slave, then honor did not exist. It was just a word. The banquets became endurance tests. The guests arrived knowing that they might leave with their lives, but they would not leave with their souls. They were participating in a play where the script was being written in real time by a madman. Rome was rotting from the head down. The moral decay of the palace was beginning to seep into the streets. If the highest families in the land were subject to this, what hope did the common citizen have? The structure of society was liquefying. And yet, Caligula had one more inversion left to perform. He had humiliated the women to break the families. Now he would target the men directly, stripping them of the one thing a Roman man valued above all else, his identity as a dominant male. The final frontier of Caligula's conquest was not a geographic border, but a psychological one. Having shattered the sanctity of the family and the distinction between God and man, he turned his eyes toward the very bedrock of Roman identity, the concept of masculinity itself. In Rome, to be a man of vir was to be active, dominant, and impenetrable. A Roman senator was the master of his world, a figure of authority who commanded armies, slaves, and households. To be placed in a passive role, to be made submissive, was a fate worse than execution. It was a social death. Caligula knew this, and because he knew it, he decided to turn it into a play. Ancient texts, corroborated by fragments of administrative documents found in Alexandria in 1989, detail a series of events that seem almost hallucinatory in their audacity. These were not the dark, whispered orgies of the gossip columns. These were formal, public ceremonies. The emperor began to organize weddings. But in these unions, he was the groom, and the bride was a high-ranking male aristocrat. The most infamous of these cases involved a man named Lucio Vitellius, or a figure of similar standing, depending on the interpretation of the fragmented text. Vitellius was a pillar of the state, a man who had governed provinces and commanded respect. Yet, the tablet from Alexandria lists him in a marriage contract where the roles are inverted. Picture the scene in the Forum or the Imperial Gardens. The witnesses are gathered, senators, generals, priests. They stand in a circle, their faces masks of stony neutrality. In the center stands Caligula, dressed in the toga of a Roman husband. Beside him stands Vitellius. But Vitellius is not wearing his senatorial robes. He is draped in the flammeum, the saffron-colored bridal veil that covers the face of a virgin bride. He stands with his head bowed, holding the distaff and spindle, the symbols of domestic female virtue. This was not a parody. It was conducted with the terrifying seriousness of a legal proceeding. The dowry was declared. The vows were exchanged. The bride was led to the emperor's couch. For the Roman elite, this was the ultimate inversion of the universe. It wasn't just about sexuality. The Romans had complex views on desire. This was about power. By forcing a consul, a leader of men, to publicly adopt the dress and posture of a submissive wife, Caligula was stripping him of his auctoritas, authority. He was demonstrating that under his rule, gender, rank, and identity were fluid concepts that he could reshape at will. The psychological impact on the Senate was catastrophic. If Vitellius could be turned into a wife by imperial decree, then no man was safe. Every senator who walked into the palace wondered if he would be the next to wear the veil. They began to walk differently, speak differently. They avoided making eye contact with the emperor, terrified that a lingering glance might be interpreted as a solicitation. Caligula had achieved the impossible. He had emasculated the conquerors of the world without drawing a sword. The Senate became a room of ghosts. Men who had once debated the fate of nations now sat in terrified silence, their identities fractured. They realized that their titles meant nothing. In the face of the emperor's imagination, they were merely clay, waiting to be sculpted into whatever shape amused him that day. The message was absolute. There is only one man in Rome. The rest of you are whatever I say you are. While the aristocracy was being dismantled in the banquet halls, the city of Rome itself, the physical and economic body of the empire, began to heave under the strain. The madness of a ruler does not stay confined to the palace. It trickles down into the gutters, the markets, and the barracks, until the whole organism is poisoned. By the year 40 AD, Rome was exhausted. It was an exhaustion felt in the treasury. Caligula had inherited a massive surplus from Tiberius, a fortune built on decades of frugality. In less than 4 years, he had burned through it all. He poured gold into projects that defied logic. A bridge of boats across the Bay of Baia so he could ride his horse across the sea. Ships built with jewel-encrusted sterns. Showers of coins thrown to the mob from the palace roof. But when the gold ran out, the fear began to monetize itself. Merchants in the forum noticed it first. New taxes appeared overnight. Taxes on food, on lawsuits, on prostitution, on the very act of entering the city gates. The predictability of Roman law, which allowed commerce to flourish, vanished. A shopkeeper could be fined his entire livelihood because the emperor decided his sign was offensive. Prices rose. Hoarding began. The hum of the market changed from the busy noise of trade to the hushed whispers of uncertainty. The common people, whom Caligula had courted with games and gifts, began to realize that a generous tyrant is still a tyrant. The bread was free, but the air was heavy. In the military camps along the Rhine and the Danube, a different kind of tension was brewing. The legions were the iron skeleton of the empire. They respected strength, discipline, and order. What they saw coming from Rome was chaos. Orders were issued and countermanded in the same week. They were told to prepare for an invasion of Britain, only to be ordered to gather seashells on the beach as spoils of the ocean. Veterans looked at each other with unease. A soldier can die for a cause, but he cannot die for a joke. The discipline began to fray. The centurions, the backbone of the army, muttered in their tents. They knew that a Rome led by a madman was a Rome vulnerable to the barbarians waiting in the forests. The city felt like a person holding their breath for too long. The construction sites of Caligula's unfinished temples stood like open wounds in the city skyline. The statues of the emperor, now omnipresent, stared down with those lifeless marble eyes. It was a silent collapse. There were no riots yet, no burning buildings, but the social contract, the invisible agreement that says we obey because you protect, had dissolved. Rome was no longer a community. It was a collection of frightened individuals trying to survive the storm. The citizens walked with their heads down. The priests performed their rites with trembling hands. The entire city was waiting for the other shoe to drop, knowing that when it did, it would likely crush them all. As the political and economic structures buckled, the final safeguard of the Roman mind religion gave way. The priests of Rome, the pontiffs, and augurs were the guardians of the Pax Deorum. Their job was to interpret the will of the gods and ensure the city remained in their favor. But how do you interpret the will of the gods when the man sitting on the throne claims to be Jupiter? The temples fell silent. The augurs stopped looking at the sky because they were terrified of what they might see, or worse, that they would see nothing, and be forced to invent a lie to please the emperor. Religious ceremonies, once the heartbeat of the calendar, became hollow theatrical performances. Prayers for the safety of the state were replaced by prayers for the longevity of the living God. But in the shadows, deep within the private quarters of the palace and the villas of the disaffected, the silence was finally breaking. It did not start with a roar of rebellion. It started with a whisper, a nod in a hallway, a hand squeezed a little too tight during a greeting. The conspiracy against Caligula was not born of ideology. It wasn't led by idealists dreaming of the old republic. It was born of sheer, desperate survival. It was the antibodies of the state finally attacking the infection. The men involved Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard, whom Caligula had mocked relentlessly, Cornelius Sabinus, and key senators, were not heroes in the traditional sense. They were terrified men. They were men who had been humiliated, forced to wear veils, forced to watch their wives degraded, forced to bow to a horse. They realized that Rome could not survive another year. The body was dying. "If we do not cut out the poison," one conspirator reportedly whispered, "we will all rot with it." The tension in the final days of January, 41 AD, was palpable. The air in the palace was thick with paranoia. Caligula, perhaps sensing the shift, became even more erratic. He spoke of moving the capital to Alexandria, leaving Rome behind entirely. He threatened to massacre the Senate. The conspirators knew they had no time. It was them or him. The fear that had paralyzed them for 4 years suddenly crystallized into a cold, hard resolve. They were no longer afraid of dying. They were afraid of living one more day in this nightmare. The gods remained silent. No omens warned the emperor. The birds did not fly in formation. It was as if the heavens themselves had turned their back on the Palatine, leaving the god to face the mortality he had tried so hard to deny. Rome waited. The giant was about to fall. The end came not with a thunderbolt from Zeus, but with a dagger in a narrow corridor. On January 24, 41 AD, during the Palatine Games, Cassius Chaerea and the conspirators cornered the emperor in a subterranean passage beneath the palace. The details of the assassination, the first blow, the chaos, the screams are well recorded. But what is most telling is not the violence of the act, but the feeling that followed it. When the news spread that Caligula was dead, Rome did not immediately erupt in joy. It froze. The people couldn't believe it. They had been conditioned to believe he was immortal, or at least unstoppable. For hours, the city held its breath, suspecting a trick. Was this another test? Another part of the laboratory experiment to see who would cheer? But when the confirmation came, when the body was removed and the Praetorian Guard began to scramble for a successor, the reaction was complex. It was a mixture of profound relief and a deep, nauseating shame. Rome woke up like a drunkard after a 4-year bender, looking at the wreckage of its own dignity. The senators who had danced in veils, the husbands who had offered their wives, the priests who had worshipped a girl goddess, they all had to look at each other again. They had survived. But at what cost? Seneca, the Stoic philosopher who lived through this era, would later write that a ruler without self-control is a slave to his own passions. But his words carry a darker implication for the people who served that ruler. What does it say about us that we obeyed? The tragedy of Caligula was not just the story of one man's madness. It was the story of a system's failure. It revealed that civilization is a thin layer of ice over a deep, dark ocean. Caligula proved that if you press hard enough, the ice cracks, and we are all capable of drowning in our own cowardice. The Senate briefly dreamed of restoring the Republic, of erasing the memory of the Caesars, but the die was cast. The Praetorians found Claudius hiding behind a curtain and proclaimed him emperor. The cycle continued. Rome moved on, because empires must move on. But the scar remained. For us, looking back across 2,000 years, the story of Caligula is a mirror. It is not just a tale of ancient cruelty. It is a warning. It asks us a question that is as relevant today as it was in 41 AD. What happens when power loses its limits? We see it in history, time and time again. When institutions fail to check the whims of a leader, when the truth becomes malleable, when dignity is sacrificed for survival, the laboratory of Caligula reopens for business. The story reminds us that the true danger is not just the monster on the throne. It is the silence of the room. It is the moment we decide that it is safer to look away than to speak up. Rome survived Caligula, but it never quite forgot the terror of the night when the lights of the Palatine burned bright, and the world learned just how fragile the human soul really is. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the shadows of history. If this story captivated you, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We are dedicated to uncovering the quiet, human truths hidden behind the great dates of history. Turn on notifications so you don't miss our next documentary, where we will explore another forgotten corner of the past. Until then, remember, History is not just what happened. It is who we are.